Welcome back to another episode of the Genius Podcast. My name is Karen Doyle, your host and founder of the Genius Project, an initiative for Catholic women designed to support and resource you towards growth in all areas of life, spiritual, personal, and professional. We seek to do this through our online courses, the Catholic Women's Masterclass, our Catholic coaching programs for women, the Genius Podcast, which you're listening to, and our other resources and live virtual Catholic Women's Summits. If you're interested in learning more about any of these initiatives, you can visit our website, www.geniusproject.co, or you can send me an email, karen@geniusproject.co. Over recent months, the Genius Podcast has grown so much, and we're so grateful for your support. If you are liking what you've heard on the Genius Podcast, can I invite you and ask you to do me a little favor? Go onto the podcast platform and leave a review and a rating. This really helps to spread the work and the mission of the Genius Podcast, and we'd be very grateful. You can also join us on Instagram, genius_project_daily, or you can watch the live recording of the podcast on the Genius Project YouTube channel. Ladies, if you haven't signed up for the free live virtual Catholic Women's Summit, please head on over to the website www.geniusproject.co and do that right now. You are not going to want to miss the keynote talks that are going to be happening at this live virtual summit. We bring together some incredible Catholic women who are going to give keynotes. Over these couple of days, these women are going to pour their wisdom, their encouragement, their formation into you so that you are filled, so that you have your cup full to go back out and be Christ's witness and presence in your sphere of influence. So ladies, head on over to the website, sign up right now before you listen to this podcast, because I'm serious, ladies, you are not going to want to miss a minute of these keynote talks. So on this week's episode of the Genius Podcast, we're continuing our discussion around vocation. We've been taking a look at our different vocations in life and how we live our universal vocation out through marriage, religious life, or the dedicated single life. Today, it is my great pleasure to bring to you an interview with Luanne Zurlo. She is the author of the book Single for a Greater Purpose. In this conversation, Luanne and I are going to be talking about living the dedicated single life. Now, if you're not in that current state of life, I encourage you not to tune out. Stay with us because we're going to be looking at both the struggles and the joys in this current season of life, and how as religious and married women, we can come alongside women who are living the dedicated single life and really support them in their vocation. In her book, Single for a Greater Purpose, A Hidden Joy in the Catholic Church, Luanne shows that contrary to popular opinion, the single life is often a holy, joyful vocation lived out, but sometimes in a hidden way by people who have had an authentic encounter with Christ. She sheds light on this little understood vocation that's discerned and embraced by a growing number of single people who neither marry nor enter religious life. She says that these souls are joyfully single for a greater purpose, nourishing both the world and the church with the unique spiritual strengths and graces that God gives to souls who deliberately remain single for Him, who are in the world but not of the world. Luanne is the Executive Director of the Braille Public Charter School Network and a voluntary after-school Catholic faith formation program in the South Bronx. Prior to joining Seton Education Partners in 2018, Luanne taught finance, Catholic social doctrine, and educational reform in developing countries at the Catholic University of America. She's had an incredible career, and she now spends her time working in a faith formation program in the South Bronx. I really hope and pray that this interview blesses you, whether you are living religious life, married life, or the single life. Luanne has some great pearls of wisdom to share with us today. Luanne, it's wonderful having you on the Genius Podcast. Welcome all the way from the East Coast of the United States.
Well, thank you for having me. It's probably easier time-wise for me than it is you right now.
Actually, it's not too bad. It's 8:30 in the morning, so I've just got all my kids off to school, and it's a great time, actually. So you're joining us from New York, is that correct?
I am, yes.
And you've just been away for a little while, you were saying.
Yeah, so it's today's Labor Day, so it's kind of the official start of our, if you will, the school year, the fall. And
Yes.
so I've been in Maine for big chunks of this summer, which is a little north of, about 5 hours north of New York on the coast.
Yes, it's beautiful. I've actually traveled up there many years ago, back in 1999, which is a very long time ago. My friend and I backpacked around the United States, and we went up through Maine in the fall. So it was just stunning. I remember it. It's quite magnificent, isn't it?
It is. It's a beautiful state. Summer, fall, winters are long, but it's a
Yes.
beautiful, beautiful state.
We traveled up to Prince Edward Island. My friend she loved Anne of Green Gables. And so we went up there and we were there for a week trying to find the bridge where Anne and Gilbert kissed until we realized that was actually in Nova Scotia. So it was quite the expedition, but it's a stunning part of the world. Well, look, Luanne, we're going to be deep diving. We've been looking at vocation in the Genius podcast over the last couple of weeks, and one of the books that you've written is Single for a Greater Purpose. And so you've actually been requested by a number of women in Australia to be a guest on the podcast. They've reached out and they've read your book actually, and they found it so helpful in their season and their vocation of being single for the Lord. But before we dive into that, I'd love you to give us a little bit of context and background about who you are and what you do.
So I was born Catholic in a very good Catholic family in the mid 60s. And because of my father's job, we moved around all over the place in the States, Europe, Puerto Rico. So I always kind of early on, I had an international experience and ended up studying and living in Europe then when I was older for a number of years. And ultimately ended up in an international career on Wall Street following Latin American companies. So I spent about a decade traveling quite extensively throughout the region, working crazy hours. It was during the 90s and early 2000s, during the big kind of Wall Street
Yeah.
bubble, if you will. And I had what everyone, the world, I should say, said would make you happy. This great job at Goldman Sachs, this great apartment in New York, everything, success. And something left me really empty. And I never left my Catholic faith, but learning kind of basically growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was a bit of a dry period. And so I through a series of providential events, started going on some retreats and really learning about my faith, and met a few really good Catholic priests that were able to answer a lot of questions. And it led me to the discernment that I just needed to leave Wall Street. I wasn't sure what it was going to be. And then I was downtown during 9/11, and that had a big impact. We actually, I was just a few blocks south, saw from our window. And so that gave me the impetus, finally, kind of life's short, to really do something different with it. I ended up founding a not-for-profit that worked with education in Latin America and ran that for a little over a decade until I discerned that God was calling me elsewhere. And I spent a little sabbatical, 4-month sabbatical that I kind of created for myself in Rome. And I studied some theology at the Angelicum, which is the Dominican university, and just spent a lot of quiet time in prayer and study. And at that time, I was starting to come to the thinking, I don't know if it was yet the realization that God was calling me to himself, that not to be married. Like, I think most of us growing up just assume we're going to get married and have a family. And I think I did not grow up having access with a lot of religious sisters. So frankly, I never thought of myself as a nun. Although when I came back more deeply to my faith, I gave it some serious discernment and visited some convents. And it was just clear to me God was not calling me to that. So when I came back, I actually, when I was there, I met 2 Dominican theologians at the Angelicum that really helped me. One that really encouraged me in my writing, and another one who really helped me with the theology around, is this a legitimate vocation, and under what circumstances might it be? And really, what is vocation at the core? So I spent a couple of years thinking about it, doing research, and then sat down and spent about 4 or 5 months holed up writing it. And so that was a
Beautiful.
few years ago, and where we are today.
Yeah, fantastic. What a fabulous journey, and what an incredible experience you've had. You've experienced Wall Street, you've experienced discerning religious life, like so many different experiences in there, which is just so interesting. I could spend the whole day chatting to you. I find people's stories fascinating because we learn so much, don't we, from one another in our stories.
And the other thing, I think it was Pope Benedict Emeritus who in a sermon, and it's in the Old Testament, God writes straight with crooked lines. And I think especially for those of us that discern dedicated single life, most of our lives and our paths have been pretty roundabout.
Absolutely. And I think that, like you said, sometimes if we're not called to religious life and say we're not called to marriage, there is this sense of where do I fit? Like, I know that for myself, and I shared this on our podcast, we went through a season of infertility. I've been married to Jonathan for 22 years. We have 3 children now, but the first 6 years of our marriage, we couldn't have children. So some of the questions that I asked was, who am I as a woman? What does my marriage mean? Like, if I can't be fruitful and multiply. And I imagine when you come to a season of singleness, there are some of those deep existential questions as well that you're asking. What are some of the questions that you sort of asked, I guess, that soul searching as you discovered and moved into this vocation of singlehood?
Oh, that's a good question. I dated quite a bit, and even even a couple of good Catholic guys. I won't say that they were all probably great marriage material, but there was never someone I thought, oh my gosh, I want to give my life to. Because that's what I think marriage is. We know it, the sacrament of marriage, you are handing your life over to a certain degree, and helping bring someone to heaven. And I never really met someone I was willing. And then I kind of, at early stages, thought it was me. Oh, I'm being too picky, too selfish, to this, to that. And then as I said, I threw a lot of, and you really need to spend a lot of time on your knees. I remember one priest telling me, just pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And it's so true. And the God will reveal it, sometimes not as quickly as you want, but and I finally came to discernment. It's like, no, I'm not doing wrong things. I'm not being selfish. God wants me for himself. And I remember I would pray the rosary, and each decade I had a different thing I would pray for. And each of the mysteries, the luminous, the sorrowful, the glorious, the joyful, there'd be one decade that I'd pray for a husband like Joseph, Saint Joseph. And then I started praying for just the peace to do God's will, whatever you want, God. And then that's when I started to think, I had this sense, well, what about me? From Jesus. And so it was slow. It wasn't this kind of hit you over the head thing.
Yes.
As it relates to fertility and fruitfulness, without a doubt, there are different forms of fruitfulness and spiritual maternity, spiritual motherhood. And I've been in a lot of roles where I've people have worked with or for me, and then I've been in teaching roles. And those in particular are great platforms to express this spiritual maternity. I've read a fair amount of Edith Stein, and she's so wonderful on this topic, as is Saint Pope John Paul II. And so for myself, I'm able to express it in a work context, not in a physical motherhood context. For God and his infinite wisdom, never instilled in me a really strong instinct to be a physical mother. I never was the type that played with dolls. I assumed I'd always be a mother, and I love children, and I like love being with children. Um, and I don't know if that's common within, I think so. For me, that hasn't been so much of a sacrifice or a burden, a cross. I know for some women, not having physical children is a great cross.
Yes. Yeah. There's many, and we'll come back to this, I think, because there's many blessings in each of the vocations, but there's also a cross in each of the vocations. And we can come back to that because walking with a lot of women here through our Sisterhood Catholic Women's Ministry in Australia, I find like a lot of women come to me and they're like, I'm really praying for a husband, and they have their eyes absolutely set on this. And I do point out that you can actually be really lonely in a marriage. Like there are actually some things that are much worse than being single. Like I think sometimes we have that negative lens, or some people throughout that journey of discernment feel like it's a real negative in their life and it's a real cross to bear, which it is. Like I do acknowledge that. But I also want to point out that there are also crosses in all vocations. I know women who are religious sisters, and there's a cross and a grief as well that comes with the blessing of that vocation. And so I think we have to always keep that in mind, that there is a cross and there is a blessing with each vocation and state of life. And whatever one you find yourself in, Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. And then we also are called to make a gift of ourselves in that particular vocation. But you mentioned, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I also think God gives us the crosses that we're meant to have.
Yeah.
So I think, so I say, I write in the book, I think a lot of people that have a vocation to dedicated single, or being dedicated to Christ in the real world, if you will, I think a lot of us too are introverts, and need a lot of time alone. And I think a lot are those that that pray in a contemplative way. And so I think, many of us actually that alone time is something they embrace. It's not often a cross. It can be, without a doubt, it can be, but it's also, some of us are made to be alone.
Yes, and that's how God's created the human race. We're all different expressions. So, Luanne, I'm wondering, well, you mentioned Edith Stein, and I'm a big fan of Edith Stein. I think if I had a patron saint of the Genius Project, she would be it. But she talks very much, doesn't she, and unpacks beautifully this idea of a theology of womanhood and this idea of vocation. And vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, which means to draw out, to call forth. I'm wondering, through all the reading and I guess the reflection and study that you've done, if you can unpack that idea of vocation for us, because I think that we lose sight in the busyness and the hustle of this world. We lose sight of the fact that we're actually called, we're being drawn towards something. We're not just merely existing, trying to accumulate possessions and success and pleasure. We're actually made for something beyond this world. And so often, I think, in marriage, single life, religious life, sometimes we can get bogged down in just the heaviness and the weight of the mundane routine and forget that we've got to lift our gaze to heaven. We've got to keep our eyes on the fact that we have a vocation. We have an individual vocation, but we're also called to live our universal vocation in a particular state, whether that's religious life, being single for the Lord, or through married life. So I'm wondering if you can unpack for us a little bit about this understanding of vocation, what that means, because I do believe that when we connect with this idea of vocation, a deeper meaning and purpose drops for us.
As Christians, our number one vocation, each and every one of us, is to live out our baptismal promises. That is hands down our number one vocation, to develop a relationship with Christ and to get ourselves to heaven through God's infinite graces. And that is first and foremost. We all should and strive to be saints, no matter. And I think I think sometimes a little bit of a confusion, or I should say overlap in the idea between states of life and vocation. Now, in the Catholic Church, the clear vocations that we speak of are ordained, religious, and married, and and single hasn't kind of fallen in there. But historically, the two key vocations the church has always thought of, like as a state of life, meaning it's a permanent thing. And that's a key element to the understanding of vocation within the Catholic Church. This is something that is thought of to be permanent. Marriage is permanent, religious vows are permanent, ordained life is permanent. And so to be single, to be viewed, I think, as single as a vocation, and I call it dedicated because you're dedicated or for the Lord. Your mindset is, this isn't until something better comes around. This is where God has placed me until I die. And so I think that's vocation is kind of this sense of this old term of state of life, where in the olden day, like back in, until recent centuries, most of us lived in the same place and did the same thing our whole life. There's so much more fluidity and movement now. And so that sense of doing anything permanently is almost anathema to our culture. And so that's where that sense of vocation being permanent is important within the church context. Having said that, the papal theologian who helped me on this, Father Wojciech Giertek, I'll never forget, he says, we're going to find out our vocation when we go to heaven. There might be like one moment in your life that God made you for, and it's not necessarily going to have anything to do with your permanent vocation or your state of life. And so, in that sense, our vocation is to unity with God and to live Christ today. Today, the gospel reading for Monday was, all about fulfilling the wounds that in Christ as kind of sacrifice in our sacrifice. There's so much, that's the economy of how God works. And I think in that respect, our vocation is letting Christ live through us. And so I guess I'll stop it there, but I think I've write a lot about the idea of kind of what it means to be a vocation and how we've thought about it in the Catholic Church. I think you made a comment earlier that I do think is really important to address, and that is, we live in obviously a fallen world, but we live in a particularly difficult time culturally. It's a pretty bad cultural waters we live in.
Absolutely.
And there more and more now, there are more adults that are single than there are married. And the rate of marriage has gone down in most countries, certainly in the developed world, and not for good reasons. And so I think that's a little bit of an added cross for those who take their faith very seriously and feel called to live in the world espoused to Christ. And because a lot of people, and especially faith-filled people, there's this assumption, like the rest of society, you're too selfish, or you're living like that, the kind of the non-ideal that you see out there. And the other kind of challenging issue is single in our society can mean anything from like libertine, crazy lifestyle to living, a life like a religious sister, if you will. And so there's no kind of outward, there are some outward markers. I mean, perhaps how you dress and how you act, without a doubt, but you're kind of put in the same category as like this vast pool of people that are swimming in so many different directions.
Yes. So how do you set yourself apart, I guess, living the dedicated single life?
Well, it's really by your life. There's so many ways in which you stand out when you have friends, visitors over, and you get up to go to daily mass, or you have iconography in your house or a prayer corner, the way you talk, the way you interact and treat people, the way you dress, the way you serve others. Oh my gosh, I think it just kind of, it almost screams, but in a subtle way, that there's something different
About you. Yes. No, it's beautiful. So, Luanne, you wrote this book, Single for a Greater Purpose. I'm interested if you can unpack, I guess, the core premise there, because you talk about a greater purpose and the hidden joy and the hidden hope that is in within this vocation that I think people aren't really connected with on many levels. Can you unpack a little bit about your book and I guess some of the core gems that are in your book, Single for a Greater Purpose?
Well, when the working title was A Hidden Joy in the Catholic Church, because when I finally discerned that Christ was calling me to himself in the world, I had such a peace come over me and a deep joy that despite the hardest times, it's never left me. I never had a profound peace until I came to this realization. And I think a lot of people who are searching or waiting for their vocation to unfold in the case of marriage life or trying to figure out which religious congregation, whatever the case may be, until you find it, you're searching. There's a little bit of a lack of peace. And I know a number of single women and men who, even though they're older and they kind of assume they're not going to get married, there's still a sense of it might happen. And I think, and there's a quote by a close friend who's a really extraordinary woman, devout woman. She goes, there's always a little bit of a lack of peace and emptiness there. And I felt it. I know that feeling well, until I embraced Christ wholeheartedly, like permanently. So now I'm losing the train of thought. What the original question was, I was going somewhere with that and I forgot where I was
That's
going.
okay. It was the core premise. You started with the working title of the book. And
Oh, the word, that's right. So hidden joy. So sorry.
no, it's all good.
That realization, it's been a joy, and yet it's hidden because on the surface, like, who wants to be that spinster? Who wants to be that old, single person? On the surface, it's kind of like nothing you'd ever want. And in fact, it's so interesting because I quote in here, it was Augustine who, and then during, the early centuries of the church, virginity, and, before religious orders, there were, consecrated virgins. They'd often live at home. And then gradually over the centuries, it evolved into congregational religious life. But there was a warning, early popes, and Augustine said, warning, don't become too prideful, because people put that vocation so on a pedestal, and you thought, it was so easy to become prideful. And I think how ironic, because today, if you live a chaste life and you're single, yes, people they think it's the worst thing going. And so it's very hidden. And I'm like, on the contrary, it's a vocation that supports greater humility. And I am absolutely convinced humility is the fourth theological virtue. Humility is so important, as our Blessed Mother says to Saint Faustina what she asks her, what are the most important virtues? And she says humility, humility, and humility. And so this is an innately humble vocation, but joyful. And then the editor, he didn't think that would be understood. And one of my chapters, I'd label it Single for a Greater Purpose. And what's so interesting is it was one of these kind of throwaway, I just popped it out. I didn't even think much of it. And it was trying to differentiate being single in a way that's not your secular way of being single, but single for something deeper and more profound.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's really important too. There's a conscious choice that you obviously made there, and a lot of women make. But I'm wondering if you address this in the book and what your advice is to women who really feel called to marriage. And we know that there aren't a lot, once you reach a certain age, sometimes there's not a lot of good men left in the church because a lot of them do get married earlier. What's your advice to the woman who really has that longing and that grief? She yearns to have children, she yearns to have a family, but that hasn't happened for her. How can she come to peace with that in her life?
Well, I think I think we are it I consider this kind of like after World War I and World War II. We're dealing with a lot of called war debt. After World War I and World War II, so many men died that you had such a mismatch between the number of men and women, and there were a lot of women that could not get married. Physically were not men. Now today, as you said, like the good ones off, the quote unquote good ones, if you will, get married early. And there really is. There are fewer and fewer people out there that are formed in a way that truly can engage in a sacramental marriage. They're deeply wounded people, whether it's psychologically, whether it's spiritually, they have no sense. Economically, I go through kind of, there's morally, economically, psychologically, spiritually, there are many reasons why there are fewer marriageable people. And women, I think more so for women, we're dealing with a profound economic challenge where there are fewer men working now than even women. And so historically, women would always would tend to marry men that would have greater earnings power, or at least earnings power. And we've reversed that. Women are graduating from university and graduate programs at much greater degrees than men. So yes, it's a difficult marriage, quote unquote, market out there. And there are many women. And in fact, there's a quote in here from Pope Pius the 12th that he writes a beautiful quote about addressing those women that had dreams of getting married and after the war couldn't, and how God has them in the crook of his hand. God knows what he's doing. And that's where you just have to learn to trust. God loves us and knows us better than we know and love ourselves. And as much, that's where you have to, and that's what I had to do. You pray for detachment, a prayer for God, not my will, but your will. And he truly will gradually either, I don't know if I say change your mind, he gradually gives you a peace and a sense that whatever unfolds is the right thing. And so I think, I do think when you're so gun-ho on something and you become depressive about not getting it, it is a lack of trust and this sense that you know better than God.
It's a hard message to hear, isn't it? I think about times in my life. I mean, I'm married and I have children, but there's things that I've prayed for over the years. And obviously one of those was children. And there's been other prayers and intentions that I've prayed for, and the Lord hasn't answered them. And there's been a desperation in my heart and in my prayer where, I don't know, you look back, it's like a Job experience, and you look back, and once you've actually walked that journey, it's only in hindsight you can see that the Lord was leading you, shaping you, changing you, conforming you more to his image through that, I guess, that cross or that journey, whatever that is. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of that scripture, the clay in the potter's hand, how the Lord shapes us and molds us. And I remember reading that during a particular season of praying for an intention. And the words came to me, well, Lord, sustain me while you're shaping me. Because yes, we can surrender to him. We can say, yes, Lord, change me, shape me, do what you will with me. But there's still what you're talking about, that internal battle, that internal struggle. And we need him to sustain us as we continue to keep coming before him, don't we? And laying that down, laying our desires down.
I've said this a number of times. Our greatest disappointments often end up being our greatest blessings.
Yeah.
Often I've looked back and I said, thank goodness that didn't happen, or that did happen, or whatever. And I also quote I love Walter Ciszek, and the Jesuit who was in a Russian Siberian prisoner of war camp for like 20 years, crazy.
Amazing.
He Leadeth Me. It's an incredible book. He was so strong-willed. I mean, he was so strong-willed. When he was a youngster in Pennsylvania, his dad actually had the local policeman arrest him or put him in jail for a night or something because he was kind of a little bit of a hooligan, and he just said he needs to learn a lesson. And I always think, God, don't let me be so strong-willed or so pig-headed, if you will, like so hard that it takes 20
20
years.
years.
It's after 20 years in a Siberian prison camp up in Siberia, he finally said he had his real conversion because he was
Wow.
so anxious about the torments he was going through and the tortures. And finally he says, I give up, God. That's it. I give up. And he says, at that moment, I became a Christian. And
Wow.
I think that's what it took for him. And you think, make
Gosh.
it a little easier.
Well, Job is the same. We reached
Yeah.
the book of Job, and he's like, he gives and he takes away, and I'll say, blessed be his name. Like it's it's quite an extraordinary message, isn't it? Like we can hear it as Catholics and as Christians living our life, but to really start to live into that is something else, which takes a really great surrender. And I love that litany of surrender,
Yeah.
which is
Well,
very,
it's going from the head to the heart, and that's a painful journey often.
yes, it is. Luanne, look, I'm wondering if you can highlight for me. I'd love to do this, and we're looking at this in each of the different vocations and states of life. But really, what are the greatest blessings in this vocation? Because sometimes we can be so focused on the negative that I guess what we focus on grows, right? So I often find in marriage, if we're going through a difficult season, that if I focus on gratitude of what I'm grateful for in my marriage, what I'm grateful for about how Jonathan shows up and serves, that grows, and the irritations are dialed down. So I'm wondering, what are the blessings in this vocation and this season for you? And then I guess looking at what are the crosses and how we can deal with those.
So, time for me is one of the greatest blessings. I'm really busy in my job. And I think many of us who have this vocation are very active in our jobs and different volunteer and many different ways to be busy. But when you don't have to get up in the morning to feed your children or to go to morning prayer, like I think it's the most dangerous vocation because you have to create your own discipline
Yes.
and make
And
sure
rhythm.
that using that time in a fruitful, godly way. But if you do, you could like you really have time to pray. You can spend an hour, 2 hours in the morning where even I know often in a religious life, the schedules are pretty rigid and tight, where this is a vocation where you can mold your day to what most suits you spiritually.
Mm.
And so for those of us, who have more of a contemplative or introverted or orientation, I think it's really wonderful. Um, it also leaves you free to kind of serve many people. I think it's a vocation that potentially provides a lot of variety because you have the freedom to do different things. And so for those of us that tend to like to have variety, I think that's also a great blessing. The great fear I think most of us, many have, is what's going to happen when we get old? Who's going to take care of us? And I mean, I'm not there yet. Father Groeschel, I remember going on retreat with him once, and he had this really practical advice. He says, get to know your nieces and nephews very well. I
Yes.
thought it's very good advice, actually.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think the greatest fear is like being left alone, dying by yourself, but you're not by yourself. Even if you end up dying without another person next to you, God is with you, and he's going to take extra special care. It's back to trust.
Mm.
God knows what he's doing, and boy, you give yourself to him, he's going to repay you 100-fold. He really will.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Luanne, I'm wondering if you can share with me how, I guess, the other vocations can support women who have chosen to be dedicated in the single life. And we're sort of looking at how the vocations complement each other. Like, I know for us raising a family, like we've had a lot to do with the Missionary of God's Love Order here in Australia and the Dominican sisters from Nashville, and we've been to the mother house in Nashville, and my children have experienced, I guess, those routines of prayer. We stayed there for a week and we go to prayer with them. It was just such a rich and a beautiful experience of, I guess, this complementarity of vocation, how each of us can, I guess, learn from one another in our different states of life. But I'm wondering how we can come along, people in religious life, people who are married, come alongside women who are living the single life and support them. What are some insights that you could offer married women, religious women, on how we can best support women living the single life?
Well, one thing that I think is really helpful, or I really appreciate is when my married friends with kids or not, they bring you into the family. And I think that can be so beautiful, to have experiences in the family with others, and to be helpful, especially with kids, whatever the case may be. I think one thing that is joyful, I mean, just if you're not joyful, then that's something God wants us to be happy and joyful. And I think there's no better, it's like honey, you collect people with honey. And if you're joyful, that's infectious, that attracts. And I think if you can live your vocation in a joyful way, I think that shows both married men and women that to perhaps place less pressure or weight or onus on your spouse to make you happy. That we each alone have to develop a close relationship with God. And we can be happy with God alone. So I think sometimes marriages, especially in more modern days, there's so much burden placed on them to make people happy. And that's tough sometimes. I think what I notice is there, at least in the States, a lot of priests live alone, depending how things are structured. And I think I often get together, I know in both New York and in Maine, other dedicated single women, or married women, and often we'll come together and invite a priest over. And I think it's really important to reach out to priests, but in a prudent fashion, of course, in a very prudent fashion. And what I notice is often many of us are dedicated singles. We have the time to read a lot of theology and to read and keep, and often you can have very thoughtful or deep conversations with religious or priests around those issues, but yet you have such a secular world or real, quote unquote, real world perspective on things. So you really kind of have you have a foot in both camps. And I think it provides a particular perspective that can be helpful to priests or religious. And then prayer, I should have started with that. Many of us, I know I feel a strong commitment to be praying for our priests. They are under such attack, and they need our prayers. That's number one. And when you're a single, dedicated single, you don't have children. I would imagine, I don't know, 75% of the prayer time of married women, mothers, is their children. So if you're not praying for children, you have like free space on your hard drive to be praying for others.
Yeah.
And for me, that's often filled with priests.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think it's that call, isn't it? Each person will have their own unique call or drawing towards a particular way to intercede. When you said that, I'm picturing you praying in the peace and the silence. I think about my prayer this morning. I get up and have my shower early, and then I have an hour of prayer, try to have an hour of prayer in my bedroom, and I have two doors that are shut. And I can hear the sliding door open. I'm like, I'm praying. It's like you sort of constantly being drawn out of that and the irritation. I'm like, no, I was just praying. It's like, give me a moment.
But if the fact that you work for an hour every morning, that's extraordinary, actually.
Oh,
I mean,
I try.
that's really extraordinary.
It doesn't always happen, but I think my husband and I very early on, one of the Carmelite priests actually said to us, he's now a bishop, he said, the success of your marriage will depend on how well you each cultivate your individual prayer life. And so Jonathan and I have always fought for each other to get that time and to go to adoration. So that's always been something that we've fought for one another to get. So, but I find he's an early morning person. He'll get up at 4 a.m. and he'll have his hour then before he goes off cycling. He's always been a little strange in that regard. But I've battled, when my kids were really young, it just wasn't possible to get the same kind of prayer. They're early teens now. And so
But that's your prayer, obviously.
it
You
is.
know,
And I think Claire Dwyer wrote a beautiful book, This Present Paradise, on St. Elizabeth of the Trinity. And she speaks very much into, I guess, women who can't get that time for prayer when they've got little children. And I really recommend that to women listening if you're a young mother to get that
yeah.
book, because it's that perspective. We can put so much pressure on ourselves as women and to tick the boxes, and then we can become a little too rigid. But really, like, the question is, where is God asking you to serve? Where is he asking you to make an offering in your vocation? And yeah, it's a beautiful perspective shift. And you've picked up on this a number of times, that we're living in really interesting times at the moment in terms of just globally what's happening, but just the whole, I guess, the insidious nature of this self-absorbed culture that we're in, and it's all about me. And I think what you've done so beautifully today is helped elevate our gaze towards, I guess, a greater vision, like the Lord's vision, like a greater plan that he has for each of our lives, especially, I guess, for yourself and for women living a dedicated single life.
You know, one thing I wrote about this a bit in the introduction, because we're living in such a difficult moment, where it's a very sexualized culture.
Yes.
And so someone who can live a joyful life, giving up what society puts so much emphasis on, and yet be joyful, I think that's a strong, that can be a really powerful witness. I also think we're increasingly less churched and more, I know that's the case in Australia, it's definitely the case in the United States, where more and more the younger people categorizing themselves nuns, N-O-N-E-S, no, meaning no religious affiliation. Well, it's so, before you'd see a priest or religious, and anyone can relate and they know, oh, that's a holy person. Now they're so distant from that understanding of even what that is. So it's, I think God may be calling more people out, dedicated singles and married people. But the thing with the dedicated single, especially a woman, is you're able to work probably often, in a more intense way, or out in the field, meeting people that probably would have no access to a religious or an ordained. And so effectively you're there, probably often could be their only link to the
To faith, to
to
God.
kind of a model of Christianity.
Yeah.
And so I do think it may be like a vocation for the time. In the 20th century, we have the church, there's been, you have the prelate Opus Dei, and you have these, you have different kind of religious orders where you're kind of out more active. And I think this is just kind of one more, perhaps another expression of how the Holy Spirit might be operating. It's just, it needs people in all corners of the world that are kind of freed up, if you will.
Yes. Yeah, so beautiful. I'm thinking of a friend of mine, and she's living, single life, and she's living it magnificently, actually. And she's such an incredible gift to people. She has such a beautiful heart. I often think of her as this shepherdess. She just, not the shepherd, but the shepherdess who just notices and observes all the people on the fringes, and she goes out and she's constantly meeting with them and meeting their needs and being present, being available in a way that I simply cannot in my current season. And I often sit back and just really have so much deep respect for her in the way that she does that. It's quite beautiful. Well, Luanne, thank you so much for joining us on the Genius podcast. Where can people go to find your book, Single for a Greater Purpose?
Um, it's so you can get it. It's published by Sophia Press. So I pulled it out. It's been
Fantastic.
it's published by Sophia Press, but you can still get it on Amazon. So either Sophia Press or just
Beautiful.
on Amazon. And
I'll put some links to it in the show notes so people can to check that out. Thank you so much. So blessed by this conversation.
well, thank you, and I will pray for the listeners.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Luanne and you really got something out of it. So if you'd like to purchase a copy of Luanne's book, you can find Single for a Greater Purpose on the Sophia Institute Press website, which is www.sophiainstitute.com. So ladies, in closing this week, I just really want to encourage you to head on over to our website, www.geniusproject.co, and sign up for the live virtual Catholic Women's Summit. This is a free event that you can attend. This will be our third live virtual Catholic Women's Summits. The last one we had over 1,000 women gathering from all around the world. So ladies, I don't want you to miss out on this event. It is going to be incredible. The women who I've invited to come and share and pour into you have something really special, as have all of our guests on the summits. But these women are really just wanting to fill your cup over these couple of days. So please make sure you go on over and register for the event on our website, www.geniusproject.co. Until next week, ladies, have a really beautiful week. God bless you. And I look forward to you joining us next week as we continue this conversation on vocation.